So what role can gardens play in pollinator conservation? Here's what really excites me. I think that gardens are critically important for the conservation of pollinators and the ecosystem services of pollination, which are delivered by those pollinating insects. When this paper came out of Chicago in 2014, I literally started jumping up and down in my office. I was so excited. So what these folks did is they took potted tomato and eggplant, and they drove them around in a truck to different neighborhoods in Chicago. They had some asters in there as well. And then they parked the truck on a sidewalk near a sidewalk in Chicago, and they counted how many pollinators visited those flowers in different neighborhoods. And then they took the eggplant and tomato back to the lab, and they measured what eventually was produced by those pollination visits. So they measured yield of those plants in the lab. And what they found went against all traditional dogma. They found that both bee abundance and richness, so they had more bees and more types of bees in the most densely populated neighborhoods of Chicago. And further, they found that that translated to larger tomatoes and larger eggplant. So they found where you have more people, you have more bees. Where you have more bees, you have more pollination. And where you have more pollination, you have a better harvest. This is really, in my mind, to my knowledge, the first documented instance of us having a positive impact on an ecosystem service. And the mechanism for our positive impact is gardens. Where you have more people, you have more gardens. And when you have more gardens, you have more flowers. Where you have more flowers, you have more bees. So this is absolutely fantastic and exciting to me. And this is actually what we found in my lab group in New York City. Prior to coming to Oregon State University, I was an assistant professor at Fordham University in New York City. And as an entomologist in New York City, rather than studying roaches or West Nile virus, I stumbled onto studying gardens. And I'm very glad I did, because they're very understudied and very interesting from a scientific point of view. So we worked, this graph comes from 19 gardens in East Harlem and the South Bronx. And we measured the area of each garden in meters squared that was planted in flowering plants. And then we looked at the richness of bees, or the number of bee species and the number of butterfly species that we found in those gardens. And you can see that for both bees as well as butterflies, there's a positive association. The more flowering plants you have, the more species of bee, the more species of butterfly that you're going to have. Now, we measured several other factors as well. We measured tree canopy cover, we measured the identity, we counted the identity of those plants, we looked at sunlight irradiance, we measured everything that you could possibly consider to measure that could explain bee diversity in these gardens. And the number one thing which kept coming out as being the positive promoter of diversity and abundance in gardens was the amount of flowering plants that you have. Oh, we also measured like the surrounding green space, like in how close they were to Central Park or how close they were to Crotona Park. It didn't matter. It was just the abundance of flowering plants within gardens, such that we were able to estimate that for every 11 meters squared of flowers that a garden had, they would net 1 additional bee species. For every 25 meters square of flowers that a garden had, they would on average net 1 additional butterfly species. Now that is a lot of area, and a lot of home gardens are not necessarily going to be able to transition 25 square meters to a flower bed. But one of the questions that we're interested in right now is, what is the aggregate effect of your flower bed with your neighbor's flower bed with their neighbor's flower bed? Can that make a difference? We don't have the answer yet, but we are trying to figure that out. Of all of the studies that have been conducted in home and community gardens, a total of 213 species of bee have been collected from a garden in the United States. So 213 out of 4,000 species, and that's from about 6 studies that have intensively studied bees in home gardens. So not too shabby. The ones which were most broadly distributed were the European honeybee, of course, was found in every study. This other non-native bee, Megachile rotundata, an exotic leaf-cutting bee, was also broadly distributed. But there was one native bee, Halictus legatus, a sweat bee, that was very, very common across all gardens that have been studied to date, whether they were in Ohio or New York or California. This one native bee is very strongly associated with home gardens. I did want to mention that even gardens as understudied sites, I do believe that there's a lot left to discover. When we were working in New York City, there were actually 2 species of bee that were collected, one by our lab group, that had never been described by science before. So in essence, we discovered a new species of bee in one of the most densely populated areas of the world in New York City. This particular species is called Lasioglossum Gotham, the Gotham City bee, which just goes to show you that we really don't even know what's right under our noses, and there are discoveries waiting to be made in our own backyard, which is one of the things that most excites me about studying gardens. I really also am interested in gardens as a temporal bridge for food for bees in the period after the native plants stop flowering in the forest and the period before agricultural crops start flowering and bloom in the summer. Gardens compared to forested habitats and agricultural habitats tend to provide food all year long because you grow a garden because you like flowers, so you probably are selecting flowers that bloom from early spring to different ones that bloom in the late fall. So gardens in that respect are secure, semi-permanent sources of forage for bees in this landscape where flowers are otherwise just a flash in the pan when we're talking about our early spring ephemerals in the spring, and kind of also a flash in the pan in the summer when we're talking about our agricultural crops. I'm also interested in gardens because we are starting to see more urban encroachment into previously agricultural areas. The reason I'm interested in this urban-rural interface is because I suspect gardens might be providing a refuge for bees from agricultural stresses. Agricultural areas tend to be managed quite a bit, tilled, chemical use, whereas home gardens are not. It is possible that home gardens are serving as a refuge for bees from agricultural stresses, and or that they're actually serving as a source of pollinators to those agricultural crops early in the spring before bees have become established in the field. So those are just some of the things that we're studying right now. Don't have the answers to them just yet, but I hope to in the relatively near future.